thought that today we could look at, there's a verse I want to look at from the Gita, but I think the two verses that precede it will add a lot of value to discussing the verse that I'm thinking about looking at. There are sometimes books of spiritual sayings that are made to be read chaotically, where you're just supposed to open up the book and read a random page. The Gita is not a text like that. The Gita is 700, give or take, verses, organized in 18 chapters around themes, and it takes the form of a conversation where Arjuna, the protagonist, asks Krishna questions, and then Krishna gives answers, which then lead to further questions. The idea that spiritual truth is revealed chaotically is the cornerstone of systems of divination. And so, Krishna Shakti, just close that door for me. Thanks, man. In the same way that I don't roll dice if I want to find out what I'm supposed to do with my life or make a major decision. I don't play a random game of chance. Or in the same way that I don't get a deck of cards and then randomly shuffle the deck and pick out a card if I'm looking for guidance about some important area of my life. In the same way, I don't throw an I Ching or a tarot when I'm looking for guidance in life, because those systems of divination are games of chance. No different than going to a slot machine or playing craps at the casino or shuffling a deck of cards and picking out a random card. In fact, I believe that the 52 card deck we have is actually older than tarot in terms of like the origin of the game. And so a lot of times people will take a spiritual text and they'll just open it up to a random page, and they'll look for inspiration from that page on that day. Probably most of us have done that at some point in your life when you're struggling. The problem I see with that is that it's based on an unstated premise that God's best means of reaching out to you in times of need is through influencing the laws of physics when you play random games of chance. I think it's pretty easy to argue that such a deity would not be all good. Certainly, such a deity doesn't seem to be the source of this universe, because when we look around this universe, we find that things follow rules and laws and they're systematically arranged. And so when you look at the laws of physics, which govern chemistry, and the laws of chemistry, which to a large extent govern biology, the world actually makes sense. It's systematic. If you look at initial causes, you can, generally speaking, figure out what's going to happen in due course of time. And everything is organized just so. Given that the deity who made this world made it, then that says something about the nature of that deity, God being logical, systematic, and reasonable. But a deity that would make the best way of communicating with somebody through influencing random games of chance isn't that deity. It's a chaotic deity. It's a non-Euclidean deity. It's more of a Lovecraftian deity than it is a deity of this world. Did you follow that? So just by looking at the nature of this world and how systematically it's organized, I always try to come late to class, but then it's like you guys just dedicated to come even later than me. Makes it next to impossible for me to get any momentum going. Let me just start again. Everybody's got to say hi to everybody else when they walk in, too. Because they're the center of the world. I don't even mind. It's just hard for me to pay attention. Let me start again. If you look at this world and you see that the nature of this world is that things are organized and systematic and they follow rules and forces like gravity and electromagnetism, and you find Fibonacci sequences, and there's a logos and a logic, and actually the world works according to logic. And then you're trying to think of what would have made this world. The being that would have made this world, and it would have to be a being because we're beings and have individuality, and where'd that come from? But that being who made this world, if you want to figure out something about the nature of that being, you look to the child of that being, namely the world, and what do you find? You find logic and reason and systems and laws at every step. What does that tell you about the nature of that creator? It tells you that those qualities exist and adhere within that being. If that's the case, then you would expect real religion or real spirituality to be systematic. What you wouldn't expect is that the best spiritual advice you could get would be from rolling dice or throwing an I Ching or throwing bones on the ground, which essentially is the same thing, but it gives more room for the person to interpret it. If you roll dice, you just get the number you come up with. But if you throw bones and tea leaves down and you look at shapes in the clouds, then you got a big playing field. I would argue you'd be better off just getting a therapist at that point who actually knows you, can just give you advice, instead of having somebody give you advice in the guise of reading tea leaves. And then it would be preposterous to think you're going to, like if God's going to talk to you through a deck of cards, and like, oh, I got the Duke of Clubs. Is a Duke? Is that a correct? Jack. Sorry, man. Okay, it's not the Duke. So you got the Jack of Hearts, and that's God speaking to me through. That would be like ridiculous. You go to Vegas to find out what God wants you to do, and pull the one-armed bandit. You look at what comes up on the slot machine, and that tells you. Such a person has a schizoaffective disorder. They're schizophrenic. They're living in a word salad world. But then somehow if you sex that up a bit, you call it tarot, or if you call it I Ching, or it's a few years old, and it's exotic, then all of a sudden people take it way more seriously. But the core of it is a random game of chance. Did you follow that? So either you're rolling dice, random game of chance, or you're looking at shapes in the clouds, and at that point you might as well just get a therapist. Both of those things are incongruent with the systematic deity that would have made this world. Therefore, when you're looking for meaning, don't just open the Gita up and look at a random page. Read the book that was written systematically by the author to be studied to understand his thought process. If that happens to be God, then there you go. There's your systematic deity right there for you. But you're taking something which was designed to be used one way, and you're using it in an off-label use, but you're almost using it for something that's counter-indicated for. It's the opposite of what it's used for. Like, oh, I found this great knife. Okay, let me stick it in my eye. Like, it's not just an off-label use. It's an off-label use which is really counter-indicated. Did you follow that? We should not chaotically use logical things. If we looked around the world and we lived in a chaotic world, more of a Lovecraftian universe, then perhaps that rolling of the dice would be the way to come in contact with that chaotic and definitely not all good deity. But we don't live in such a world, and so we should approach spirituality with the same rigor we would approach anything else in life that we want to study and gain some mastery over and gain some excellence in. Did you guys follow that? I feel like after I cried a bit, you guys started listening better, so I'm happy about that. Things calmed down. It's like, so somehow nobody walked in afterwards too. I got like that brief moment to speak my piece. So anyway, I thought of a verse I wanted to read from the Gita. And so I thought of the verse. I know the verse by heart, so I thought of the verse. I didn't have to look it up. But I thought of it. And then I thought about the verse that came before it, and I realized, actually, if you really want to appreciate this verse that we're going to read today, you actually have to understand the verses that come before it. Because that's a systematic text. So that's my theory. And I'm going to try with the rest of the time we have together to prove that. Okay? So here are the verses that come before it. Try vidya. Those who know the Vedas. Vid is where you get the word video from. Vidya, it's in the feminine, it means knowledge. Usually it means esoteric knowledge. It's very popular in tantric literature. But vidya in Sanskrit means knowledge. Comes from the Sanskrit root vid, which means to know. It's a verbal root. It's where you get the word Veda from, books of knowledge. And it's where you get the word video from, in English, which gives you knowledge of something because you see it. I think it's linked to the word idea also, which I believe comes through German. But this word vid is a big term. So we have try vidya, the three kinds of knowledge. Okay, so those three kinds of knowledge refer to the three Vedas. How many Vedas are there? 4 Vedas, but not really. It's actually not really the case. How many Gospels are there in the New Testament? 4. That's apostles. There's 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But 3 of those Gospels are called synoptic. They tell the story of Jesus. One of the Gospels is somewhat anachronistic and out of step with the other 3. That's the book of John. It's generally considered to be composed later. And what you've really got with the Bible is you've got 3 books that tell roughly the same story with some divergence, and you've got 1 book that tells a whole different story. The Vedas are kind of like that. There's 3 original Vedas, Rig, Sama, and Yajur. And then there's 1 later Veda. How late is it? Well, it's late enough that Krishna doesn't even mention it in the Gita. How's that for late? It's the Atharva Veda. It's the Veda of spells. Gave rise to Ayurveda to some extent, Indian medicine. It has a bunch of incantations in it for controlling people. It's a real sort of wizard spell type book. It's also got a bunch of practical knowledge in it. Like I said, early medicinal tradition is encoded within it. But it's not considered to cover the same subject matter as the other 3 Vedas, which are about yajna, the ancient Vedic sacrifice, which is quite similar to other religions. The Jews used to sacrifice animals on an altar. Did you know this? That's the gig. And all of Christianity is actually based on this idea, because Jesus was the Lamb of God, the sacrificial Lamb of God, the Paschal Lamb of God that was then sacrificed to rescue all of humanity. And so the sacrificial motif that was there as the core of the Jewish revelation lived on in Christianity and became the spine of Christian theory. The idea of the sacrifice of Jesus to wash away the sins of man, the same way the Jews sacrificed a lamb. Leave it open, please. Leave it open, please. Thank you. The same way the Jews sacrificed a lamb to wash away their sins. And so the Vedic cult was no different. It was a sacrificial cult. And so there were vegetarian elements of it. We represent one of them. We represent the vegetarian wing of the Vedic cult. Not all the wings of the Vedic cult were vegetarian, but we were. We sacrificed grains and ghee instead of animals, but some of the Vedic cult sacrificed animals. And so the 3 of the 4 Vedas deal with yajna, the ritual sacrifice. And so, try vidya, somapa, drinking soma. This again goes back to the old Veda, the three Vedas. Who knows what Soma is? What is it?
An elixir.
What elixir?
From the demigods.
Soma is some substance that we don't know what it is. People have written books and been trying to figure out what Soma is since Indologists started operating. Let's leave that door open. Krishna Keshak, just open it all the way. I want that wind. And then go in the backyard, tell everybody to be quiet, and open that door too. Let's get a little cross ventilation going. Make sure everybody's quiet. Nobody knows what Soma is. It's a plant that you get from the Himalayas. It's described like that. And then you have to treat it and do stuff to it, and it becomes this elixir. An easy way of saying, yeah, it's an elixir from the gods, but it actually describes where to pick it. But when they describe what it looks like, it doesn't look like any plant that we have. So you're left with these real minimal descriptions of what you do with Soma, and you're trying to figure out what it is. I think Soma is probably the ephedra plant, which grows in the Himalayas and is a stimulant. And I say that because the Aryan people, the Vedic people, say they drank Soma and rode into battle. And so if it was psilocybins, mushrooms, I don't think that would help people riding into battle. If it was cannabis, ganja, I don't think that would help people ride into battle. It seems like it was some plant, but the plant is described sort of half like a plant that you would go and find in the Himalayas, and then half like a plant that came from heaven. And so you're left, there's just not enough to go on. It's too cryptic, abstruse, and mythic, the description of Soma. And so you don't quite know what it is. And you're left speculating, trying to figure it out, as people have been doing for over 100 years. But Soma was popular in the Vedic tradition. A Soma yagna was a big yagna. You would distill Soma, and then you were allowed to drink it. It was some sort of intoxicating, exhilarating beverage. And for the people who followed the old Veda, not our group, not our wing, but some of those other wings, they were really into the Soma. Tri vidya soma pa puta papa. Puta papa means purified of sins. So the people who perform these yagnas, yagyai ishtva swargatim prartayante. They're praying, prartayante. They're praying. Prartana means prayer. They're praying. What are they praying for? Swargatim. They're praying to go to heaven, to enjoy. But in the Vedas, heaven isn't the spiritual world. Heaven is a place you go to for a minute and then come back down. So it's like a better neighborhood in the universe that you ultimately get evicted from. It's an important point to understand, otherwise the verse doesn't make sense. Swargatim, pointed towards Swarga, pointed towards Swar. Swargatim, Pratente, they're praying, Ishtva Yagyai, and they're worshiping with yagnas, me. And how are they doing it? Tri Vidya, according to the three Vedas, Soma Pa, and they're worshiping me with Soma, drinking Soma, and they're purified. So it's not that this stuff has no purification attached, it's actually making them better people. You guys follow me so far? It's a thick culture. Just in a single verse like this, there's a whole culture behind this verse. To be able to understand the words in the verse, you have to have a familiarity with the culture that the verse came out of. There is no spiritual revelation devoid of a cultural delivery mechanism. And to appreciate the spiritual message, you kind of got to learn the culture. It's the way it works. In fact, the idea that you can distill spirituality and take it away from its cultural roots is a modern American and European concept that's become popular in the last 100 years or so, called postmodernism, subjectivism. And so the very notion that you can, reductionism, the very notion that you can take a message from a culture and then just rip away the cultural trappings and just have the message, that itself is a very continental European and American idea that can be, what do I want to say, located culturally within the last 100 years or so in Europe and North America. Did you follow that? That itself is a cultural idea. The idea that you don't need culture is itself a cultural idea. Do you guys follow that? Okay. Trividyamam soma paputa papa yagyaishtva swargatim pratayante te punya asadya surendra lokam. They approach Surendra Lok. Indra Lok. They approach Indra Lok. Te punya, by their punya, by their piety. Ashnanti divyan divi deva bogan. And they enjoy heavenly delights in that abode. They eat them. Ashnanti means they eat. So, knowers of the Vedas, our tradition, drinkers of Soma, not so much our exact tradition, but on the periphery. Puta Papa, purified of the sins. Yagyai Ishtra, having worshipped Mam, me. Swargatim Pratayante, desiring heaven. Te Punya, by their piety, having been purified. Asadya Surendra Lokan, they approach the planet of Indra. Divyan Divi Deva Bogan Ashnanti, and they enjoy and they eat heavenly delights in heaven because of their piety, because they've been purified by performing these Vedic rites. You follow? At least here we don't see anything about animal sacrifice. So at least Krishna was vegetarian, but he did acknowledge the Soma drinkers, which we are not. This idea of Soma became Ras. And the idea of Ras is where we got the term Bhakti Ras from. And that's why our theologians chose to describe the flavor of one's love for Krishna as Ras, because they were linking it to the older tradition, saying this is actually what was cryptically being talked about in the old tradition was Bhakti Ras. Do you guys follow that? So this whole idea of Soma Yagna and drinking Soma and preparing Soma, that idea, that notion got extrapolated on and reinterpreted. And it became the core of our tradition of Kirtan and Bhakti Ras. There was back in the days of cassette tapes, some Bengali devotees came out with a cassette tape of Kirtan called Bhakti Ras. But in Bengal, you don't pronounce Sa. Your sibilants all become Sha. And so it was called Bhakti Rush. But then when they wrote it down R-A-S-H. And so the Kirtan tape said Bhakti Rash. Like people are breaking out in rashes of Bhakti all over the place. You remember that tape? It came out in the early 80s. Okay. Before my time. Like when I got there, it was already there. So what happens to these people? It's super not what Krishna's into. Why is he talking about this? Tetam bhuktva sarva lokam vishalam. After having enjoyed Swarga Lok or heaven, after having enjoyed that bhuktva, after having enjoyed it, Vishalam, for a long time. Badri Vishal is a name for that deity up in Badrinath. Badri Narayan, a very famous deity of Vishnu, located on the border of India and China that we go to sometimes. He's known as Badri Vishal because there's many Badri berries growing around that area. Vishal means like numerous. And so after enjoying for a long time in a very broad way, then Kshine Punye Martya Lokam Vishanti, they enter again into the world of death because their punya or their piety is kshine. It's been exhausted. It's been diminished. Evam trai dharmam anuprapana. Those who follow the three Vedas, gatagatam, they come and go. Kamakam, lavante. Kama, they desire desires. In context, it means they desire material enjoyments. It literally means they desire desires. And gata agatas agatam. They come and they go. They go up, they come back down, they go up, they come back down, they go up, they come back down. They achieve some piety, but they're still materialists. So they go up, then they exhaust their piety, they come back down again. Because kama, because they're desirous things, they're desiring material things, labante, and that's all they achieve. So the idea of a heaven you can go to that's not a permanent place, the idea that you can have religion that's not actually pure, the idea that you can be a materialist but still follow the rules of a religion, the idea that there's purification that happens but it's not a full purification, the idea that within the Vedic tradition there's different rungs and there's a hierarchy based on one's motivation, that there's rituals that are for people who have lower motivations, and then rituals for people who have higher motivations. That's all included in these two verses. Trividya, those who know the Vedas. Soma Pa, who drink Soma. Bhuta Papa, they're purified. Yagyai Ishtva, they worship Mam, me. Swargatim Pratayante, but they desire to go to places of enjoyment. Then te punya, by their piety, asadhya surendra lokam, they go to the planet of Indra. Divyan divi deva bogan, and there ashnanti, they enjoy heavenly delights. Shine punye, until their piety is exhausted. Vishanti martya lokam, and they fall back down into this world. You follow? Tridharmya. Anuprapana, for those people who are attached to that type of religion. Gata agatam, they come and they go. Kama, because they desire material things. That's what they value. Labante, and that's all they achieve. Did you guys follow this? So within those two verses, which precede the verse that we want to read today, and inform it and make it exponentially more powerful to a full order of magnitude, you have an entire religion which is being critiqued. There's the Veda, but there's the materialistic people who follow the Veda and the real people who follow the Veda. They have different desires. One of them just wants to make a better mousetrap or a better rat race or a better hamster wheel for themselves. But they're purified. And they're actually religious, but they've got these material desires, and they get them fulfilled in a purified way, in a higher abode, but eventually they come back down because their material desires bind them to this world, even if, like a tetherball, they sometimes appear to fly up. You guys know that game? Tetherball, it's the string with the ball and the pole. You're hitting it, but it always comes back. It's the nature of the game. Or like a yo-yo. You guys all following us? Okay. And then Krishna has an alternative. Here's his alternative. Ananya chintayanto mam. They who think of me and nothing else. So the previous people are doing elaborate rituals. And they're being contrasted to these people whose only ritual is that they think of Krishna, but they think of Krishna ananya and no other. Anya means other. Ananya means no other. Ananya chintayanta. They think mam, of me, ananya and no other. Ye jana par upaste. People who engage in worship, those people, and their worship consists of just thinking of me and nothing else. You follow? Tesham nityabi yuktanam. Yukta is the past participle of yoga. It means yoga. Nityabi yuktanam. They're always yoga and joined to me. By always thinking of me and not thinking of anything else. Tesham, for them who are nityabhiyuktanam, for those people who are always thinking of me and nothing else and are thereby yoga to me incessantly. Yogakshemam vahami aham. I carry them what they lack and I preserve what they have. Kshema means preservation. Yoga means acquisition. So I give them what they need, I help them acquire what they need, and I preserve what they have. Vahami, I personally carry them. Vahami means I carry. First person singular present tense. It literally means God carries this to you. There's a famous story about this. There was a 12th century sadhu. His name was Arjuna Acharya. He was a commentator on the Gita, Sanskrit Pandit. He lived in Odisha. He was writing a commentary on the Gita, and while writing a commentary on the Gita, he came across this verse and he thought, Krishna is so big, he's God. Why is he having to personally carry people's stuff? And so he crossed out, it was written on a palm leaf manuscript, he crossed it out with a stick. You write on a palm leaf manuscript by carving into it with a stick. And then you put some type of dirt or some type of like carbon, something like that, and you put it over it, and then it fills into the gap, and then you can make out the words. It's the indentation that you're reading that can then be filled in, and this is for parchment. The parchments don't last that long. And so he crossed out the word vahami, I carry, and he wrote the word karomi, which means I make it done. I do it. Because if you say I do it, it means Krishna arranges for those things to happen. But not that he's personally doing them. That seemed a bit ridiculous, the idea that God would personally come down to carry what you lack and preserve what you have. And then it was his time. Brahmanas take bath before they eat. So it was lunchtime. So they take bath 3 times a day before breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And so he went out, he took his ritual bath, put on fresh cloth, came back home. When he got back home, his wife had cooked and eaten, and the food was getting cold, and nothing, like everything was like done. And he was super upset. I mean, he wasn't really upset. He's sadhu. But he said, Devi, why is it that normally you always wait and we eat together? And we've been married 30 years and 40 years. You've never once eaten without me. What happened? And she said, I don't want to see you anymore. I'm leaving you. We shouldn't say that. There's no word for divorce in Sanskrit. But she said, I'm over this. I don't like you anymore. Go away. And he said, what happened? And she goes, I didn't realize how cruel you were. I thought you were a devotee. Now I see how cruel you truly are. He said, what are you talking about? She said, those boys came. Those boys came. You mercilessly beat them. They were bleeding. Whip marks from you whipping them and beating them. And they brought all this food for us. So many vegetables, so many grains. They're carrying them. And they're trying to bring us something, and you're whipping them and beating them. And Arjunacharya was smart, so he realized what do those boys look like? So one of them was really dark, like a monsoon cloud, wearing a yellow dhoti. The other one was super white, wearing a blue dhoti. And then he could understand that Krishna and Balaram had come to his house to bring things and thereby prove that the Lord personally carries you what you lack and brings you all necessities. And then he quickly ran back, and the whip marks were his scratching out the sacred words of the Gita and replacing them. And so, because he had to indent and scratch into it. And so that was felt by the Lord to be like whip marks on his back. And the Lord was teaching him a lesson like this. And he went back and he wrote Vahami and stopped saying Karomyaham. And he started to write Vahamyaham. I personally carry it to them, as opposed to I arrange for it to be done. So what we have here is, we looked at the 2 preceding verses, which taught us about an entire sacrificial cult that existed thousands of years ago with so many bells and whistles. We learned about Soma. We learned about the 3 instead of 4 Vedas. We learned about different types of heaven that people go to, different desires that carry them there, the types of rituals they engage in, what the results of those rituals are. But all of the first 2 verses was this very expensive, very formal, very ritualized, very, structured worship. And the core of all of it was fulfilling your personal desires. And then that is sharply contrasted to what Krishna is recommending, which is that the sacrifice, the yajna, the worship that you do consists of nothing more than thinking of him. But that thought is very pure because you're thinking of him and nothing else. And that creates nityabhiyukta, it creates an eternal connection with divinity. It doesn't result in you coming and going up and going down, but it results in you going to a place that you never leave. And that opens a door for Krishna to personally carry you what you lack and preserve what you have. The word yoga and kshema, primarily in Sanskrit, do not mean preservation and acquisition. The words primarily mean war and peace. Yoga means war in Vedic Sanskrit, because yoga is when you would yoke the word yoke is cognate to yoga. It's derived from the same root yuj in Sanskrit. And so yoga is when you would take your chariot and yoke it to your horses. And you only did that when it was time for battle, and you rode off into battle. Therefore, the word yoga in the horse culture, the old Vedic horse culture, in the Rig Veda, is used to mean war. Contrasted and used in a compound with the word kshema, which means tolerance, and in this context, peace. So Krishna is also saying to Arjuna on the battlefield, I will carry you in times of war and in times of peace, and then more generally, I'll carry you what you lack and preserve what you have. And so you have two totally different results. One is gata agatam, you're going and you're coming. Kama kama, because you have desires. And kshine vishanti martya lokam, your punya is exhausted and you fall down into this world and you're going up and coming down and you never find any solidity. And then you have a penniless, simple-hearted, but very pure devotee who worships Krishna with his thoughts, but does so incessantly, and thereby creates an eternal connection which carries you far beyond this world, and even in this world results in Krishna personally looking after you. One of our theologians, commenting on this, he made a nice point that if a king chooses to teach his son, it's not because he can't afford to hire teachers. It's actually a manifestation of his opulence that he can go and teach his son. He has nothing to do. He has unlimited ministers. He could easily have somebody teach his son. But instead, he personally arranges to go and teach his son. He personally shows his son how to do something. That's actually his opulence. He has so much free time. No one can tell him what to do. He has no master. He's the Adhiraj. He's the emperor. And what does he do with his free time? He goes and teaches his son. And so Krishna enjoys looking after and caring for his devotees who give him the one thing he doesn't have. What's the one thing Krishna doesn't have? Your love. Because love by its definition is given freely. It's the one thing you give to the person who has everything. You give them your love. Because you can't buy that. It's yours. It's always yours. Always will be yours. And so when you do that with Krishna, he then does that with you, and you end up winning so many times over because you love Krishna with your whole heart, and that opens the door for him to love you back and manifest that. And he carries you not just to that world, but also within this world. The juxtapositioning of these verses against each other, for me, is really powerful. This verse is beautiful on its own, even if you just chaotically opened the book and read it, like throwing a tarot. But when you take the trouble to not force a chaotic system on a systematic text, and you instead look back a couple of verses and actually take the time to learn the verses and understand them, then the verse becomes infinitely more beautiful. At least for me. So I had a theory at the beginning of class, and I attempted to demonstrate that by going over these verses and showing you how the previous two verses informed the last verse and brought out its meaning in a much more beautiful way. What do you guys think? Give me some feedback? Yeah.
I understood the contrast between something being ritualistic and something being simple, and the contrast between something
I understand your question. Yeah, so what is in the first verse? It's a law of karma. You became purified of your sins. As a result of your punya, you then asadhya, you approach. Surendra lokam. You approach, it's you. By the strength of the Vedic yagna and by puta papa, by the strength of your purification as a result of performing that Vedic yagna, which is still indirectly connected to the deity because it comes from the same tradition. But because it's primarily about your enjoyment, you're then in a system where you walk a stairway to heaven. And you fly as high as you can, almost like the flight of Icarus or something like that. And so that's one side of things. There's a set of rules for you to follow. You follow your rules, and then you're able to move upward. It's an upward mobility thing. It's largely distinct, although there is some sense in which, because Krishna is the origin of the Vedas, therefore there is some connection with Krishna which comes from that. The primary thing you're doing is creating upward mobility for yourself by the sweat off your own back and by a mastery of the Vedic hack and the Vedic system. The hack is really the Tantra, but the Vedic system of gradual upward mobility. That's one thing. So really what you're doing is you're creating good karma for yourself, which by its very definition then results in it eventually being exhausted. The contrast to that is you opening the door of love and bhakti and being truly devoted to Krishna, which costs you nothing more than your thought. Doesn't cost you any money. So one contrast is money versus free. Another contrast is heavy physical labor versus simple thought. Another contrast is your material desire versus a pure desire to please God. Another contrast is following the rules of karma versus opening the door to bhakti and the magic of bhakti, of a loving relationship, which supersedes the law of the land because it gets to the spirit of the law as opposed to the letter of the law. And then finally there's temporary versus eternal. And so there's a number of contrasts which are at play in the verse. Some of them are overtly stated, like the ones you noted, and then some of them are more subtly pervasive, but they're there as well. They're just unstated premises, like in many conversations. Like, for instance, you could say, I don't believe God has a form, because if you say God has a form, you're limiting God. You follow that? There's an unstated premise there. What's the unstated premise? Form is limiting. Nobody says their unstated premise. They just assume it. That's their flaw. That's why, that's the problem with people who are pseudo. If you get a serious philosopher and he writes an argument for you, he'll tell you what all of his premises are and how his conclusion derives from his premises. He'll tell you how you can argue against his premises, where the best arguments around against his premises. Then he'll counter those arguments, then tell you some other areas where somebody could make a decent argument and open the door for a robust discussion. Most of us don't do that. Most of us just have unstated premises floating around, and we view the world through our rose-colored glasses. We assume everybody else does too, and so we don't notice them. So it's natural when you're making an argument that you don't spell out every single thing. It's unnatural to have to lay out every single premise of every single argument. Most of us don't lay them out because we don't know them, and we make mistakes. And when you're debating with somebody, discussing with somebody, trying to get somewhere with somebody, you have to figure out what their unstated premises are and where there's some room for movement. But even when you do know your unstated premises, sometimes you don't always state them because it's just too laborious, and you assume a certain degree of intelligence on the part of your interlocutor, and you have a discussion, and you assume they're smart enough to figure out where you're going, and you have to treat them like they're a 3-year-old. So in the Gita, many times Krishna will half make an argument with the understanding that you're able to complete the argument. Like Shankaracharya wrote a book called Hammer Illusion. He left the verb for you, the hammer for smashing illusion. Krishna will oftentimes argue for something, and he'll just include maybe the first thing of a group of 8, understanding that if he says the first thing, it means all the other things in that category. It's a type of metonym. It's what's the word? It's a metonym, but what's the particular type of metonym I'm talking about? Where you say one thing that stands for the whole group? Oh man, you guys are killing me. I feel like such a fool. I'll come up with it in a minute. Sometimes you say, you'll say, you'll sell LA One, right? You'll sell LA One, but that means the LA Dodgers won a baseball game. But you'll say LA One, so you say the whole city, but you're actually talking about a very specific part of the city. You follow? And then sometimes you'll say one person, and it stands for the whole thing. Like you'll say, the Redcoats are coming. And so it's like the people who are wearing the Redcoats, we just say one part of their clothing, but it stands for the whole person. You follow? And so there's ways you do this in language. We do them all the time ourselves. Sometimes when you look at another language, it's not as easy for you to discern what's being done. And so you got to put a little work in. But it's the same type of things we do every day in English. Does that make sense? More? Feedback? Really? What do you got? Yeah, you.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I just really loved the way that you dove into this topic, and the introduction that you gave to the verses was really helpful. But when you told the story about Krishna and Balaram, I really just thought that was so beautiful. And that story, along with everything else, really is making me think about when Krishna says in a different part of the Gita that we're not the doer. And us being confused that we are the doer can, again, tie us down. And
I got it. So 2 points to what you said. One is that you not being the doer generally means that you should stop taking your enemy's moves so seriously and realize that everybody's being motivated by all sorts of stuff that has nothing to do with you. And they're just running on patterns out of their life. You shouldn't take it so seriously. You should start to recognize your own patterns, and that recognition of them gives you some distance from them, and you can start to see things more clearly. What you're talking about is an extrapolation from that, and now you're saying you don't have to be the doer because Krishna can step in and help you, which is a nice point. It's not what Krishna meant when he was giving that verse about not being the doer. He was making the point I was making. But you can extrapolate from that. It's a little bit poetic. It's a little bit interpretive, but there's nothing wrong with it. And now you can say, I spent my whole life trying to climb that stairway to heaven, and now I'm going to fly on wings like eagles. And it's a statement from the Hebrew Torah. And I'm gonna give myself over to a higher power and let somebody else help me try to get in that divine current, and not just try to do everything myself, but allow Krishna to drive, and let myself be a moon around the planet of Krishna instead of thinking I'm the center of the universe, and allow my life to revolve around something higher than myself. That's a nice point, and it fits. It's a bit of a jump, but it fits. It's nice. Second point you made was the story got you. Stories are valuable, narratives are valuable, sacred narrations are valuable because they teach in a different way than logic and systems and math do. They give you an emotional connection with the subject matter. They illustrate it. They bring it to life. They put it in color. And they let you step into something. Instead of describing it, you immerse yourself in it. And so it becomes less descriptive and in some ways more prescriptive. And maybe that's not what I want to say. That's bad. It becomes less objective and more subjective because you actually experience it. And subjectivity is the core of consciousness. Consciousness is, by definition, always experienced subjectively in the first person. You can objectively describe the symptoms of consciousness, but consciousness itself is always subjectively experienced. There is no objective experience of consciousness because the very nature of it is that it's always a first-person experience. Consciousness is experience. You follow? And so sacred narrations allow you to subjectively step into a teaching and experience it before you've fully done all the math in your own life. And in that way, they create a little bit of a bridge and something that spans the divide between where you are and where you could be, and it allows you to quickly and temporarily position yourself over there, almost like being teleported, if it's done right. And so stories have value, not just for less intelligent people, but even for the most intelligent people, because they take you somewhere. And then finally, Kishori?
I was fascinated with
So Soma means moon. So where you get the word Saumya from. Krishna's body is described as Saumya Vapu, a beautiful form. Saumya means beautiful, comes from Soma, which means moon. Saumya also means cooling, because the moon is understood in the Vedic tradition to have cooling rays, and the sun has heating rays. The moon is understood to give rust, even in the Gita, to vegetables, and that the moonlight gives rise to vegetables. Actually, the moon creates the tide. The moon exerts its gravitational force on Earth, and so it actually affects us. The moon is generally considered I don't know if it's actually true or not. I never bothered researching it. A woman's menstrual cycle. It's often, at least traditionally, it's called her moon cycle, because of how it comes and goes along with the moon. And so the moon has a gravitational force which is exerted on Earth that you see every day when you look at the tides. It pulls a little bit on our planet, just a little bit. And it has its rays, which are reflections of the sun, but therefore lose their intense heat, and they just give illumination and light, and they're cooling. So the moon was a very, very big topic of discussion in Vedic Sanskrit and in the Old Veda. And the moon is made of ras. It's made of liquid enjoyment. Ras means elixir. Like literally rus means like a juice or a tonic. The Rasa Siddhas were the alchemists of medieval India who engaged in alchemy. The classic one was they wanted to turn bell metal, a base metal, into a noble metal, gold, much like the Hermetic traditions of Europe, if you're familiar with alchemy. And the Muslims also did this. The word alchemy is actually an Islamic word. Anytime you have al in front of something, it means it came from the Muslims. And so the Rasa Siddhas, they made rasa. They made these tonics that people would drink. The classic one was activated mercury. They would take mercury and they would treat it with either sulfur or mica, and then that mercury would become transformed chemically. It would become chemically activated. And you take a piece of gold and drop it into the mercury, and it would just disappear because it would chemically react with the mercury, and the mercury wouldn't get any bigger. It would just stay the same size. They would put large amounts of gold in the mercury, and then they would drink it. Marco Polo said he went to India on his way to the Silk Road, and he met the Juigis, which was his word for yogis in Italian. His poor translation of jogi became Juigi. And they used to drink mercury and live for 200 years. He described the process. Aurangzeb, the famous Mughal ruler of India, drank mercury also. There's a firman, an official letter from him to a Hindu monk, and he says, I'll protect your temple if you give me X amount of tolas of mercury treated with gold. And he would take that, and it was considered to be we were ingesting gold. Gold is a noble metal. It makes you powerful. It's actually not true. Mercury is super bad for health. It's one of the most toxic substances known to man. When you say mad as a hatter, that's because hatters used to treat felt with mercury, and then you go crazy eventually from the vapors from the mercury. So mercury is like super bad. It's this weird thing they use in Ayurveda, and it was like a huge part of the Rasa Siddha tradition, which died out probably because they all drank too much mercury. And so, but that term rasa showed up there. The term rasa is used by Bharat Muni, the famous Indian dramaturgist, who wrote the books on how to write drama in Sanskrit called the Bharata Natya Shastras. And so he wrote books on how to write a play and how to put on a dance performance. And the term for the feeling in the audience when you correctly performed a play or did a dance, the feeling in the audience was called ras. That vicariously by watching you, they were able to feel what you were experiencing. That was called ras. It was a cornerstone of drama, was to create a story that people were able to immerse themselves in and lose themselves in and disport themselves in, where they lost themselves and they became one with the actor in ras. It's very different. The Greek model for making plays is it's plot-based. Your plot moves forward, like the hero's journey. Hero's journey is kind of a combination. But the rasa theory is that the purpose of a play is to evoke emotion, to make your audience cry. Prabhupada talked about being in Vaitacharya as a child in a play on Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and that when they were done doing the play, the audience was crying, and he was also crying. The actors on the stage were crying, the audience was crying, and there was a synergy, almost like a harmonic convergence, almost like a musical synergy that's created between the audience and the actors. That's called ras. And that ras is possible with a sahridoy, with somebody who has a soft heart, a similar heart, a kindred spirit. So the term ras was used in drama, the term ras was used in alchemy, the term ras was used in the ancient Vedas to describe the moon and the sacrifices that were attached to the moon, and that same word ras was used by us to describe the feeling of love between the soul and God, cultivated through bhakti and devotion. And so that term ras, like many of these terms, has a long history. And if you learn the history, you learn the culture, and then the meaning of those terms. When you find it, a lot of times a verse will have several meanings. They'll be multivalent. There'll be 2 or 3 possible meanings. Like yogakshemam vaham yaham. I carry you, you lack and preserve what you have. Also means I carry you in times of war and peace. Both meanings are equally valid in Sanskrit. Both are primary meanings in Sanskrit. And so if you learn the language, you learn the verse, you learn the different levels of meaning in the verse, and the value of them and the brilliance of the authors, your appreciation of their brilliance increases by orders of magnitude as you realize how brilliant they were, and your ability to derive lessons from the verse also increases by orders of magnitude because you see multiple layers of meaning. Thank you very much. Let's do a little kirtan. Haribol.